You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Dr. Dan Allender. He's a pioneer of a unique and innovative approach to trauma and abuse therapy. And for every 30 years, he's had the Allender theory. It's brought healing and transformation to, looks like, hundreds of thousands of people. So I'm very curious to ask him about it. So, Dan, thank you for coming.
Richard, my pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background. How did you get into aspects of healing, and how did that lead you to where you are today?
Let me just say it's a pretty circuitous, not what I would call sequential or intentional, to actually step back and go, I sort of fell into the field, part toward the end of college, where I spent most of my years, I'll just say, involved in illicit pharmaceutical sales. And if it's okay to say, drug dealing, and had a bit of an awakening that the direction I was going in life probably wouldn't have a lot of longevity, or should we say job security. And some changes began to occur. And I think because I had dealt with a lot of attorneys through the years, I just thought, I think I'll go to law school. But as my best friend said to me about April of the year we were graduating, like, did you take your LSATs? And I was like, what are those? Well, it's called law school admission test. I was like, no, I just thought I'd show up. And he said, well, you don't do that. So he asked me the question, how sometimes life gets directed by odd questions. And he said, well, are you going to get a job? And I was like, no, I don't want a job. And he said, well, if you're not going to go to law school, you're not going to go get a job. What are you going to do? And I said, I have no idea. Well, he was going to seminary. And he said, well, why don't you come with me to seminary? And I'm like, for what? And he said, well, I don't know, like study God for a year and then go to law school. And it just sounded like, yeah, it sounds interesting. I think I'll study God for a year. Well, I ended up, and make a vastly longer story much shorter, I ended up working in a church through this process, and they didn't know what to do with basically a street kid. And so I ended up working with the people they didn't know what to do with, people who had been abused, people who abused, people who were addicts, people involved in significant disarray in their lives. And I think that was the first moment of going, this is really intriguing. And I don't know what I'm doing, but nonetheless, some good, some harm, but I was captured, actually. So I went back, finished seminary, and ended up working with a psychologist in his private practice in an era where there was no licensure laws. So there wasn't a sense of doing something unethical. It was more like I learned by kind of doing it, and ended up then eventually doing a number of counseling-oriented degrees. But I was just captured at the reality that my life wasn't unique, that there was a lot of heartache and trauma in people's lives, not just mine.
Yeah.
And yet,
quick joke, you weren't working with Timothy Leary, were you?
No, Timothy was certainly somebody I eventually read a lot about. He was a brilliant psychologist before he eventually sort of doused his brain in LSD. Nonetheless, I think that sense of there was a connection to transcendence, a connection to the reality of the dark and dirty portions of life, and being able to hold transcendence and immanence seemed to be possible in the job. It didn't seem possible for me in the church, but it did seem possible in engaging trauma. So I think that's pretty much where my career began.
What does that mean? It wasn't possible in the church, but it was possible when working with, people in trouble?
Well, I think in many communities, and again, not to be critical of church or religion or whatever, but a lot of churches believe in a sense of transcendence, the goodness of God, the unseen world, but somehow naming the reality of living truly in a fallen world where everybody bears more than a mere shadow, that there really are realities of there's such goodness in us and also such capacity for harm and darkness. So naming the truth, just naming the truth about humanity, about yourself, about the world, oftentimes seem to disrupt the church more than I wanted to actually live in the middle of it. Yet, I'm a man of faith. I have deep convictions and belief and find great affinity in my connection with Jesus, but naming the reality of the darkness of my own and other hearts didn't fit well. But on the other hand, it's an odd thing to say that a lot of churches will actually have a lot of immanence, a sense of connection to the earth, to righteousness, to justice, but opening the door to the unseen world, a lot less able to do. So I think in many ways, if I can put it just this bluntly, there's a normal split in all of us with regard to everything. And when we hold things together, both the beauty of human creation and us as creatures of God, and yet our brokenness, naming both tends to not be well received in a lot of worlds.
Are you okay to provide an example or two of that? I'm just curious about continuing this line of thought a little bit. And I certainly want to get to your protocol on how to heal people. But this is very interesting. If you could say a little bit more. If you don't mind.
Well, the area that I never intended to specialize in, sexual abuse, is a good example. How well is it acknowledged, in communities of faith, whether it be the Roman Catholic Church or any Protestant church, that children are being abused in probably the vast majority of churches in this country. And that's not a criticism of religion. That's just the fact of some 40 years of working, particularly with largely a Christian believing audience. And in that, the level of harm that occurs with narcissistic, predatory, again, people, not just pastors, but people, elders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We as a church community don't address narcissism. The evangelical church's support of the past President Trump is just a pretty severe and clear statement of that. So we let all sorts of harm get ignored while making a big deal about a sense of a whole lot of other. So that split of, I don't want to name the reality that predators are part of most churches. So how do we honor the data, not go on a proverbial witch hunt, but on the other hand, create policy, create procedures, do training to address what will happen when a child, in the context of a church, parachurch organization, is harmed by some predatory action. That would be so offensive to most churches to even have this conversation.
That's weird. If I'm not a part of a church, and I'm certainly not an elder or anything, but these people are consistently around what is supposed to be the good tenets. They're being taught because they're supposed to be, again, studying their faith. So you would think there's a continual reinforcement of what you do and what not to do. Why would there be this opposite behavior? It's kind of odd.
Richard, I say amen to that. I go, what in the name of all that is good, true, and holy, why would it not be the case? But what I would say is I've worked in plenty of secular so-called institutions. Parachurch is one category, but NGOs is another, non-government organizations that in one sense have the same reluctance, even though the principles of dignity, of justice, and we're just awkward to name. Narcissism, to be very frank. And there are plenty, shall we say, in and outside of the church, in and outside of politics, in and outside of business organizations. We tend to almost laud and follow narcissists. And yet the havoc they bring in any organization is just egregious. So I think in some ways, this sense of split between the good and bad, of being able to name, no, we're a mess. We're also stunning. Can we hold both together at an individual level, let alone at a more corporate level? We have a hard time doing just that.
Yeah. Do you think that you're going to find the same narcissists and if the opportunity was there, would you also see this abuse in child care centers, in workplaces, in schools, or is it really more confined to the church? I mean, I know that's your observation. You've lived that, but what do you think about other spots?
I think, again, if we can just be, again, blunt about this, we all create mythologies, illusions about the nature of who we are and where we are and how we're engaging. We're coming up on a holiday called Thanksgiving. And, I can remember the first time, my oldest daughter, when she was probably 6, 7, 8 years of age, came back and said, I just learned about how the Pilgrims and the Indians got together and supported and engaged and loved each other and fed each other. And I'm going, oh my gosh, of course this is what you're hearing. And the dilemma is, like all history, our own personal history, but our family's history, our country's history is always a lot more complicated than the mythology we sell to 6 and 7-year-olds, let alone to adults. And, to be able to go, oh, yeah, that's really cool, but it's also not quite the way you heard it. Now, age appropriate, not wanting to throw my daughter in the deep end of historical reality, yet also saying it's my responsibility to say to my daughter, life is a little more complicated than that. In fact, the Pilgrims essentially wiped out indigenous people, at least 70 to 80% of them, due to, a number of factors, but primarily disease. It's a heartbreaking story, honey. And yes, we'll celebrate Thanksgiving and we'll talk about good things, but we also need to be able to name life is much more broken than we tend to allow ourselves civically or even familially to be able to name. So in part, what you're asking is such a great question. Why do we have a hard time with reality? Woody Allen obviously disparaged in some ways appropriately, but said brilliantly, I'm not fond of reality, but it is the only place to get a good steak. If we start with that framework of it's not something I'm actually very fond of, it calls me to something that on a day-to-day level, I don't want to have to struggle with. And that's in part being someone who works in trauma. I'm in the middle of worlds every day. And again, privileged to be in these worlds, but where due to violence, due to predation, due to just accidents, due to injustice, people are not able to hold the mythologies of life like they may have at one point. And it's where life in its darkness has a potential to actually encounter some degree of transformation. No one changes when you believe in the status quo. The status quo is committed to retaining life as it is. And change, meaning growth, can never occur if what your commitment to is keeping things as they have been. And for traumatized men and women, irrespective of what has brought the trauma.
Let's get into the protocol a little bit. How do you first encounter someone that needs the help? Do they come to you or you to them? And how does it tend to progress? What are the different ways?
Well, a good example is the privilege of doing a podcast with you. People here maybe get intrigued, come to what we call the AllenderCenter.org, or they read a book, or they listen to, whatever. So just getting people thinking opens up the possibility of going, is there not more? Is this all? Is this the inevitable that I just have to endure and live with? So getting people engaged in thought, you can do from a platform, you can do from a podcast or a book or wherever. But again, people were harmed in relationship. And people change in relationship. So, content is great, but it's the encounter with another human being that I believe is the transformative ground for us to not only grieve losses and harm, but also begin to imagine, in some sense, how I want to grow in the middle of the wounds that I've suffered. So being able to, in one sense, remember and dream are two things that trauma tends to take away. You get locked into the present, get locked into, in some ways, the realities that trauma fragments our brain. It numbs us and in some ways isolates us.
One thing that came to mind, does it, do you think it freezes people in a flight or fight? Did I say that right? Maybe I switched it. Yeah, flight or fight situation, and they're stuck in this paralysis mentally and in other ways. Is that what you're saying?
No, I think it's absolutely true. And then to be able to go, depending on your own experience in the world, you might be more oriented to fighting or to fleeing or flight. But there's also that sense, and you use the word freeze. A lot of people during the actual encounter with trauma just shut down. So shut down that you really can't think, you really can't choose, you really can't feel. And it is. I mean, people describe it as being frozen. And that's one of the reasons why, we've got to engage our body in the midst of dealing with trauma as an aftermath. And talking about it is crucial, but also engaging how your body has stored the trauma. And this is what just heartbreaking to think about. My father, who was a World War II vet, there was no chance in all of existence for him ever to talk about his trauma until, at least with me, until about the last 6 weeks of his life. To look at the effects of trauma over a person, let alone a generation that has chosen to run from or deny the reality of what their body's stored and needs to be, in some sense, engaged and released. We've got so much data now about illness, from heart disease to diabetes to arthritis. Oh gosh, just a vast sum of illnesses related to stress, biochemicals, or trauma that have not been able to be dissipated and therefore have remained in the body as a form of inflammation that has created, true dis-ease. So we're all, in some ways, having to account and deal with our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and even our own trauma in terms of being able to make a new future, whether that has to do with one's personal future or more corporate.
So how do you engage with people that have had this abuse in their life? What is, without naming names or anything, maybe with recounting a story or two, how do you give listeners a feel for what the process is like and what it involves?
What comes to mind quickly is a man that I work with, and of course, enough details are shifted and changed that it's got a kernel of full truth, but the person probably wouldn't recognize themselves. But this one element is true, and that is that he was a physician, but he hated being a doctor. And the more we stepped into his story, and that's a crucial category. You can't just talk. You must enter the story of your life, which included in this case, how did he end up becoming a doctor? And a lot of that was a deeply, deeply angry man, his father, who had been deprived of an education by his father and always had a sense that he could have amounted to more. So he was resentful. He was angry. And deeply envious of others who seemed to have both power and money. So he oriented his son at a very young age that you will be a physician. And this, my client, about a 42-year-old man, lived with this deep desire to be blessed by his father, and therefore, in so many ways, complied to a calling that was not really what he wanted to do and be. What he loved more than anything was his violin. And his father saw that as effeminate and weak, mocked him. And yet, because he was bright and competent in school, he did matriculate on to becoming a physician. So he was living the dreams of another human being, not listening to the sense of the call of his own passion, his own sense of what he's bringing as goodness to a larger world. And it took years of being an effective physician for him to eventually say, I lost my life. And so he was in depression. His marriage was crumbling. He had a lousy relationship with his younger children. But the larger work was dealing with the trauma of his relationship with his father. What he wanted to do was sort of a kind of a future clarification of what I should be doing in life. The real work was dealing with the dark heartache and brutality of a very, very hurt but consuming father. And the more he began to address the relationship that he felt so loyal to that he could never really name, he began to, in one sense, enter into the level of grief, but also to the level of shame that his father had inculcated, shaping his choices, that as he began to, in some sense, grieve and say hell no to shame, he began to get much greater clarity about what he wanted to do with his life, which was not being a physician. So a lot of the work we do as trauma therapists is not just dealing with the current event, even though that's huge, but often looking at the larger domain of where harm has come. Trauma never occurs in a vacuum. There's always, in the broad sense of the word, attachment issues with our family of origin that often are the more central, even though more subtle, issues that need to be addressed.
So does this look like talk therapy? Are there how does your program work? Which is what I wanted to get to for a while. What are the different facets of it?
Yeah, I'm a therapist. So some of my work is, with people in the proverbial 50-minute hour. But we also run groups through the Allender Center. We do something called a story workshop where we invite people in. We ask them to write a 600 to 1,000 word story that captures what it was like to live within a realm of heartache, usually between the ages of 6 and 15. And that gives us just a DNA window, a kind of look into your life to begin the process of pondering with you some of the implications, not only of that story, but the larger tableau of stories that are part of your world. So engagement with story in the midst of honoring your body. We would hold this very simple thought that kindness changes the heart in a way that mere truth seldom does. We need truth. We need truth about the nature of our lives, our world, etc. But the absence of kindness brings more consequences than almost any untruth. So we invite people to kindness and mercy, to truth in the middle of facing something of the necessity of being able to honor and bless your own story and your own heartache and your own means by which you have attempted to adapt yourself and survive in those years that you had no other alternatives but to do so. So that can be done in a group. That can be done with 6 people that you don't know that are reading stories and engaging over the span of even 3 or 4 days. We just see amazing things that happen as people begin to let just the initial periods of both grief and that sense of hell no to shame begin to actually be part of the way they relate. Now, again, I don't want to be in any way ridiculous. Short-term intensive work can open the heart and begin to get you moving, but you need ongoing conversations. And that can be with a pastor, a therapist, a rabbi, an imam. You can be with anybody who knows how to engage story well. And I've got a plumber in our church who has a high school degree and is brilliant at reading people and stories. So he's the one I often talk to about when I'm in the middle of my own form of struggle and I'll just call it sort of soulish constipation. And so I don't think it has to be a therapist, but often this is the work that good therapists do. So yeah, I would say between the interaction of group work, individual work, and then reading, writing. We've got so much research data that if you'll begin to write about your life, not type. Interesting. It's a different part of the brain when you literally use a utensil like a pen or a pencil and begin to write even 10 or 12 sentences. Research shows begins to change something of the disposition you have toward yourself regarding significant struggles. So what I would say is there are many means, including yoga, including walking in woods, 15 to 20 minutes a day, There are so many ways we need to take goodness, beauty into our being in a way in which over significant periods of time will literally change your brain. And we're talking literally, not metaphorically. We can rewire the parts of our brain that have indeed been most affected by trauma by countless means, but we need that intentionality of, I've been harmed, there's debris, and I want goodness for myself. That's perhaps more central than almost any of the other means by which I put words to.
Dan, I had started this late, so we have to end now based on timelines, but I want to have you back. It sounds like January, February, but for now, where can listeners find out about your protocol and learn more about you? Where do they go?
Well, they can go to our website. It is the Allender, so it'd be THE, Allender, ALLENDER, the AllenderCenter.org. If they would like to learn more, or they can check my name, Dan Allender, on Amazon. Amazon will parade my name and my books very kindly.
Okay, very good. Dan, thank you so much for coming. It's a very
Richard, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.